Hey guys, this is Race of History. I'm back today to do Extra History's Thermopylae Part 2. Let's get into it.
The Delphic oracle had said that a Spartan king must fall in battle, or Sparta would burn. So when a Persian envoy came with the message, "Hand over your weapons," Leonidas had one response: "Come and take them."
That's where the popular phrase Molon Labe comes from.
This video is brought to you by Total War Arena, where you can write your own history in Thermopylae. Download the game with the link below and use the code HOPLIGHT for extra goodies. The Persians advanced, 200,000 strong. Leonidas only had an advance force, 7,000 Hellenic allies, men from Thebes, Thespia, and 10 other cities, led by a corps of nearly 300 Spartan hoplites. The main army would follow once the sacred festivals ended, if the advance force was still alive, that is. Though outnumbered, the Greeks had chosen good ground. The narrow pass meant that the Hellenic allies could fight in shifts, resting their reserves while others stood on the front line, shields locked into a wall bristling with spears. Perfect terrain for the phalanx. First, Persian archers probed the line, arrows glancing off helmets and sticking in shields. But these Persian bows did little against heavy armored hoplites.
And a lot of people, I've heard the argument made, like, why do the Persians not just make a heavy infantry from scratch? This is one of those things that's argued about on things that are really hard to kind of put to scale. You know, there are a lot of groups of warriors throughout history that for one reason or another have been really good at what they do. The Roman legions come to mind, right? And there were groups that tried to replicate and create Roman legions, and they just were never as good. And that's one of the things for the Greeks is their hoplites, for whatever reason, whether it's the culture or how they train or how they thought about battle or whatever it was, and historians bitterly argue about what exactly it was that gave them this advantage. But they have this massive advantage in the way that they fight, and the Persians are used to fighting essentially people that are on horseback, steppes tribes, chariots, where archers are a huge advantage. I mean, if you have a group of chariots in front of you and you have the archer capabilities that the Persians have, then you will totally wipe away that army or a good chunk of it before you even have to get in face-to-face battle. So the way that the Persian army was set up made a ton of sense for who they were fighting 95% of the time. It was just wholly overmatched against the more well-equipped Greek heavy infantry.
Xerxes, watching from his seat on a nearby hill, pulled them back and sent in his Medes, 2,000 light spearmen, veteran campaigners. As they approached, they pulled their head wraps up over their mouths. It was August, and the approaching column raised a dust storm from the baking ground. The sides met in a moment of fury, spearheads striking and mauling. The lines separated, then met again. Combat was too exhausting to sustain for more than a minute at a time, so they fought in bursts. Clash, retreat, clash, retreat. The Medes fell, their wickerwork shields no match for the long hoplite spears. This Persian army, which had subjugated and liberated its way through the Middle East, was used to operating on plains and deserts. They practiced a light, mobile form of warfare that was no help in dislodging a heavily armored phalanx. The pass was just too narrow, the seashore too boggy for their cavalry. Persian bodies piled against the wall. Flies,
And there's a smaller group of historians that think that the way that the Greeks fought at this time period is still in the way and form of, say, Homer's The Iliad. And there are things that Herodotus points to as far as the Spartans' fighting form that kind of would make you think that that is actually how they're fighting, that it's much more of a fluid formation than just the solid shield wall that they normally go with. But This is highly contentious, and I would say the majority of historians still believe that they are fighting in the phalanx solely at this time, and that they operate all as one major unit.
Omnipresent in the Greek summer, began to collect in a humming swarm. But their numbers began to tell. The Greek line retreated, and the Medes, roaring with triumph, followed, breaking formation and raising their spears to the hoplites' unprotected backs. And that is when the Greeks wheeled, a feint. The wall of shields hit the ragged Persian formation and tore into them. From his seat on the hill, Xerxes leapt to his feet, horrified. After several more hours, he withdrew his Medes, frustrated and appalled. He sent in another column, the elite royal guard that the Greeks called the Immortals. Immortal in name, perhaps, but not in body. That much was clear by dusk. Though the Immortals did manage to pressure the hoplite line even harder than the Medes, the Greeks still held their ground. Leonidas had reason to be pleased that night. The line was holding. They were in a good position where they couldn't be outflanked. Except in one spot. On their arrival, locals had told them of a narrow mountain trail that circumvented the pass. To take it, the Persians would have to climb 1,000 meters and travel single file, but it was possible. Leonidas had dispatched 1,000 Phocians to hold this flank, but had failed to send a Spartan officer with them. He needed every man on the front line. Meanwhile, Xerxes tallied his losses. The first day had been expensive. There were more battles to fight after this, and he couldn't drain his elite units just to break these Greeks. He sent messengers to gather the bravest men of each nation in his army and amalgamate them into a single unit.
And Athens, at this point, everybody's leaving. They're getting all of the women and children and elderly out of the city. They're evacuating. They're going to offshore islands. They know what this battle at Thermopylae means. And so if the Persians are able to get through it, there is nothing, they're in central Greece at that point. And so there are southern city-states that are still safe and actually start putting up a wall further down south. However, the northern states, they are there with them at that point. So if Thermopylae falls, then that's basically it for the northern states. There is nothing else to stop this massive Persian army from just sweeping over Athens, which is their first goal.
That way, the unit would be an elite one, but the impact would be distributed if it were wiped out. But this was not a question of bravery. The Greeks were just too heavily armored and in too good of a position. By dusk the next day, the best of the Persian Empire were lying dead, with the tactical balance unchanged. And that is when a traitor arrived in the Persian camp, speaking of another way. Night comes. The Phocians holding the mountain pass have been sitting guard duty for 2 days. Without a Spartan officer to keep them in formation, they've broken up into an ad hoc camp, and they've posted no sentries. Their only warning is the crunch of dead leaves, and then the Immortals are on them. Persians have marched by night, noiselessly scaling the mountain, soft-footed and quick. This is their version of war. The Phocians run. By dawn, Immortals are exiting the pass and forming up behind the Greeks. So that's it then, thinks Leonidas. He asks his diviner to sacrifice a ram. The beast's entrails are filthy black, an omen of certain death. Leonidas makes his decision. The rest of his army will withdraw to join the allies. The Spartans and their enslaved helot attendants will fight a rearguard action to let them escape. But they wouldn't fight alone. Overcome by emotion, 700 Thespians decide to stay, as do 400 loyalists from Thebes. It is perhaps the bravest decision of the whole day. Unlike Spartans, trained from birth to expect death in battle, these men are civilians giving up lives and family. The Greeks form up, vault the wall to engage the Persians directly, and advance. With survival impossible, the Greeks lose all fear.
And this is actually a pretty big deal. Because you have a major force that is retreating, I talked about this in another video, but casualties for these battles in ancient history normally are, in comparison, relatively low during the actual face-to-face battle. It's during the retreat, when the line breaks, that you send the cavalry in and casualties just go through the roof. So Leonidas and the group that stays are fighting this rearguard action in an attempt to keep the Persians from just sending the cavalry out and wiping out every retreating Greek trying to make it back into mainland Greece at this point. So they're basically attempting to keep them from getting a spear in the back as they're retreating.
They stab until their spears break, then draw their short swords. Shields splinter, men scream. Leonidas falls early, his body sprawling amidst the Persians. The Greek line surges forward with new savagery, recapturing his body before it's mutilated. And when their swords are blunted or lost, these Greeks, Spartans, Thebans, Helots, Thespians, fight with bare hands and teeth.
So let's say you have to read an incredibly long email from your boss that you have to finish before the big...
But Xerxes has a long war to fight, and there is no sense throwing good men away just so these Greeks can have a noble death. He pulls his infantry back and calls up his archers. The victory cost Xerxes dearly. He had lost thousands of soldiers and 2 half-brothers, but he was through. He swept into Greece, sacking the cities that had refused to submit. He entered Athens and fulfilled his father's promise to burn the Acropolis, a punishment for the Ionian revolt.
And then at that point, he basically sends a letter back to the capital of Persia saying, as far as everything, concerned over here with these troublesome Athenians, it's over with. Burned it to the ground. They're done. Everything's been taken care of. Basically, like patting himself on the back saying, job well done.
But he found the city empty. The Athenian navy had forced a stalemate at Artemisium as Thermopylae raged, and then withdrawn and evacuated the city under Themistocles' orders. And a month later, that same Athenian fleet baited the Persian navy into a battle at Salamis.
There's a lot of argument about how or why this happened, but the initial story is that Themistocles essentially baits the Persians into coming in to fight a naval battle by saying the Greeks are all arguing, they're about to split up and go their own ways. If you attack now, you'll be able to completely crush them. And the story is that Xerxes falls for this essentially and sends the Persian navy into this small little cape where they get trapped.
And delivered a decisive blow. Fearing that the Athenians would target his bridge across the Hellespont and strand him in Europe, Xerxes handed command to a subordinate and went home. He was not present a year later when a Spartan-led coalition force defeated the Persian army at Plataea, ending the war. 2 great victories. Which demands we ask, why do we remember Thermopylae? Though the Hellenic allies fought bravely, they failed to stop Xerxes, or even hold him long enough to make a strategic difference. He still burned Athens. Why does everyone know the Greek defeat at Thermopylae, but victories like Salamis and Plataea remain obscure? It's because Thermopylae helped to define Greek and thus Western culture, and that is thanks to one man, Herodotus. Decades after the Greco-Persian War, Herodotus wrote a pioneering book about it, a book that would be one of the first to treat writing history as an investigation rather than myth-making. And his rousing account of Thermopylae is the story we all know today. But it's important to remember that Herodotus had an ulterior motive. In his histories, he was arguing for a pan-Greek identity, an idea that all of these competing city-states shared a culture, religion, language, and values that existed above their petty squabbles. And as part of this, he constantly contrasted the Greek West, which he portrayed as noble, free, humble, and equitable, with the Persian East, which he considered emotional, despotic, decadent, and obsessed with subservience.
And that's something that has ultimately stayed. Those ideas of the East, unfortunately, they have carried on all the way up into the modern day, and the way that people look at some of these places, countries, and armies of the East. And there are a ton of things, and it's not just Herodotus. There are playwrights that are doing plays over Thermopylae and The Last Stand there and all of that. But there is this idea that there is one solid Greek identity and devotion to the state. And there's just all of these things that were thrown on to the last stand at Thermopylae after the fact that are really hard to separate from the initial story this long after it's happened. And so, yeah, there are a ton of things, and not just through Herodotus, that have been added to the battle at Thermopylae over time that most likely didn't exist at the time that it was fought.
And slavery. As we saw last episode, that doesn't really reflect the reality of ancient Greece and Persia because, well, nothing's ever as simple as that. But it did prove an attractive story. And that problematic frame, the idea of a global East and West with opposing, incompatible values, persisted in Europe and the areas it settled. And throughout history, the story of Thermopylae would be told and retold as a story of clashing civilizations. In the 1960s, that story became about the Cold War, while the graphic novel 300 reframed it as a story about terrorism. Early Americans fetishized Sparta so much that Alexander Hamilton made fun of it. During World War II, Spartan culture found admirers in both Axis and Allied nations. Some of our retellings even suggest that the Spartans fought to preserve democracy, thereby saving the modern world from being snuffed out. Which is almost comical, since within a generation of Thermopylae, Sparta actually partnered with Persia to crush Athens and its democracy.
Yeah, almost everybody in this story at one time or another will become much more Persian or on the Persian side, or it's the same as every major civilization. When you have Rome become this huge uh, colossus empire, all of the surrounding areas around it become a little more Roman. It's the same thing here with Persia. Once they have the initial war and that culture kind of seeps into Greece and Greece's culture seeps into Persia, you see that happen where the Greeks become much more open to Persian people and ideas and everything like that.
The truth is always more complex. This contact between Asia and Europe didn't save what we sometimes refer to as Western civilization, but the melding of its cultures and preservation in history books did help to create it. The open society of Athens survived long enough for later governments to imitate it. Sparta gave many European nations their concepts of service to the state, military professionalism, and mandatory public education. And when Alexander the Great eventually conquered Persia, he was so enamored with its administration and policies that he copied them, spreading Cyrus the Great's ideas of professional bureaucracy and multicultural, tolerant society.
And that's one of the things that Darius did. King Darius, who was technically the fourth king of Persia, although two of those were relatively short-lived. One was really short-lived. But he essentially turns the entire Persian Empire into a well-oiled Fortune 500 company. It's something that he's known for and that he was considered really great at doing. He was not the guy who was kind of like Cyrus, where he was seen as at the head of an army, leading it to conquer. It was much more of an administrative viewpoint, but he is credited with a lot of that well-oiled machine that later is passed down to Alexander.
No matter where you are, you live in the aftermath of Thermopylae. But it's important to remember, neither of those two sides, Greece or Persia, represent any one of us. We are all the inheritors of both.
All right, that was Extra History's Thermopylae Part 2. This is Race of History. Like, comment, subscribe, help me build a channel over here, and I'll see you guys next time.